Have you ever stepped into a place where something feels wrong, but you can't quite explain why? Where behind polished floors and professional smiles, something darker waits in the quiet moments no one talks about? What would you do if you were a young nurse, barely starting out, and discovered that the very person trusted to heal was the one causing harm? Would you risk your career, your future, your reputation, to protect a vulnerable patient whose trembling hands and fearful eyes tell you everything you need to know? Leona Dorson never thought her shift at Vora Medical Institute would become a test of courage. But one fragile voice whispered a truth she couldn't ignore, and it changed everything. Join us in reflecting on this true story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification for more daily stories like this. Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you are watching, for we would love to hear from you. Leona Dorson arrived at Vora Medical Institute just after dawn, bracing herself for another hectic shift. At 25, she was still relatively new to nursing, having spent most of her time at smaller clinics. Working temporary contracts gave her a wide range of experience. But Vora, one of the largest hospitals in the area, could be daunting. She stepped out of her car, the early sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. The building's stark facade loomed ahead, reminding her of the hustle within. Inside the lobby, she was immediately met with the usual flurry of activity, the steady hum of voices, the medicinal scent of disinfectant, and the click of hurried footsteps on polished floors. Leona made her way toward the locker room, weaving through patients, visitors, and staff who all seemed to be moving at double speed. She paused at her locker, took a steadying breath, and changed into her red nursing uniform. Her reflection in the metal mirror revealed a determined expression, one she hoped would keep her focus intact for the day ahead. Exiting the locker room, she stopped at the nurse's station to check her assignment. The head nurse, a brisk woman with a furrowed brow, handed Leona a chart. "You'll be overseeing Clara Reynolds," she said with a quick nod. 86, recovering from a heart attack in room 412. "She's stable, but needs close monitoring." Leona scanned the chart as she walked, noting details: blood pressure logs, medication schedules, diet restrictions. It all looked routine enough, but the patient's advanced age and recent cardiac event meant extra caution was required. By the time she reached room 412, Leona felt both excitement and a hint of unease. Though she'd only worked here a few times, she wanted to prove her competence. Gently knocking, Leona entered. The room was bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. Clara Reynolds lay in bed, a frail black woman whose thin limbs contrasted with the stark white bedding. Her eyes, though tired, brightened at Leona's arrival. Leona introduced herself with a warm smile, pulling up a chair to begin her assessment. As she checked vitals and administered morning medication, Clara's voice trembled with gratitude. She spoke softly about her life, her fear of being alone, and her hope of leaving the hospital soon. Leona felt an instant connection, sensing the woman's loneliness. Though the ward was busy, Leona made time to chat with Clara, helping her sip water, adjusting pillows, and offering small comforts. Clara seemed relieved by this unhurried attention. Before leaving, Leona promised to return soon, touched by how even a brief conversation appeared to lift the elderly woman's spirits. The next few hours whirled by as Leona juggled tasks for her other patients. She administered intravenous drips, updated charts, and collaborated with doctors making their rounds. Still, she found her thoughts drifting to Clara from time to time. Something in the woman's gentle manner lingered with her. Near midday, Leona's heart jolted when she heard a shrill beep from down the hallway. The room number flashing red belonged to Clara. She sprinted past a cluster of startled interns, adrenaline surging, mind racing with possibilities. Was it a cardiac event? A simple request for help? She burst into room 412, expecting to see the patient in distress, but was instead hit by an overpowering smell. The acrid stench assaulted her senses. Her gaze fell upon yellowish stains on the bed linens and on Clara's hospital gown. On the floor beside the bed lay a tipped-over urine container. Clara's eyes held a mix of shame and fear, her fingers trembling as she attempted to gather the soiled sheets. It looked, at first glance, like an unfortunate accident. Yet, the way Clara refused to meet Leona's gaze set off alarm bells in the young nurse's mind. Leona quickly reassured the elderly woman, rolling up her sleeves to clean and change the sheets. She delicately helped Clara into fresh clothes, noticing the uneasy tremor in the patient's hands. Approaching in a soothing tone, Leona asked what happened. Clara hesitated before quietly whispering that a doctor had come in and caused the spill, then left without offering any assistance. Clara's voice faltered. She avoided eye contact, as though hiding something deeper. Leona's instincts tingled. While minor spills happen all the time, a doctor mishandling a urine container seemed odd. Even stranger was how Clara trembled while mentioning him, as if terrified to speak. Leona tried to coax out more details, but Clara just shook her head, downcast. The nurse offered a final comforting word, telling Clara she'd return soon to check on her, then stepped out, her mind abuzz with questions. She headed to the corridor, the scent of antiseptic masking but not entirely eclipsing that lingering odor on her scrubs. Why would a doctor behave in such a careless manner? And why did Clara appear so frightened? Though only a few hours into her shift, Leona sensed something unsettling lurking beneath the hospital's polished exterior. She resolved to watch Clara more closely, unaware that her next steps would test her commitment to patient care like never before. Leona spent the remainder of the morning juggling her regular responsibilities, distributing medications, reviewing charts, and assisting with minor procedures. Yet her thoughts kept returning to Clara Reynolds. The scenario in room 412 lingered in her mind, and the unsettled feeling refused to fade. Something about the patient's fearful eyes and reluctance to explain bothered Leona, poking at her usual confidence. During a quick lunch break, she sat alone at a small table in the bustling cafeteria. The noise of clattering utensils and low chatter barely registered as she replayed the morning in her head. Clara's trembling voice, her mention of the doctor who had spilled the container and departed without cleaning, the intense look of shame on her face. Every detail seemed to carry a heavier implication. Leona tapped her fork against her half-eaten salad, finally pushing the tray aside with a sigh. She knew she needed more information. Was it truly accidental? Could the elderly patient have misunderstood? Yet, the vague fear in Clara's manner felt too genuine to be a misunderstanding. Leona decided she had to find out who Clara's attending physician was. That knowledge might clarify the situation. Approaching the head nurse's station, she mustered her nerve and asked to review the patient roster. The head nurse, visibly harried, handed her the file. Leona scanned it quickly, noting that Clara was under the care of Dr. Sebastian Pierce, a name she recognized from whispered hallway conversations. Some referred to him as an acclaimed cardiologist. Others mentioned his rather dismissive attitude toward nurses and aides. Thanking the head nurse, Leona returned to her station, flipping through the notes on Dr. Pierce. He had a long history at Vora, an extensive list of credentials and numerous published papers. From the outside, he was accomplished, but rumors in break rooms painted a different picture. Someone quick to belittle staff, prone to impatience, maybe worse. Still, rumors alone weren't evidence. Part of Leona doubted any real wrongdoing. Perhaps Dr. Pierce was simply strict. She resolved to keep an open mind. That afternoon, she made her way back to Clara's room, determined to follow her instincts. If the tension she sensed was real, she needed to observe it firsthand. Perhaps a conversation with Dr. Pierce might ease her concerns or confirm them. But her schedule offered no immediate meeting with him, so she decided to quietly check on Clara again. Stepping inside room 412, Leona found Clara resting, the bed rails lowered, and the blinds partially open to let in gentle daylight. The soiled sheets were gone, replaced with fresh linens. Clara looked calmer, though still subdued. At the sight of Leona, she managed a small smile. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Leona asked if everything was all right. Clara lowered her gaze. I'm okay now, she murmured. Yet her voice held hesitation. Thank you for earlier, for helping me. Leona reassured her that it was simply part of her job. Then, carefully, she brought up the doctor again. Mrs. Reynolds, do you feel comfortable with Dr. Pierce's care? Has he visited you again since this morning? Clara's eyes flicked upward momentarily, revealing a hint of uncertainty. No, he hasn't come back. But I'd rather not talk about him too much. Respecting her hesitation, Leona didn't push further. Instead, she stayed a few extra minutes, chatting softly about lighter topics. A new book Clara hoped to read once discharged, memories of her grandchildren who lived out of state. Still, Leona noticed an undercurrent of tension whenever the conversation skirted hospital staff. Something was definitely amiss. Leaving the room, Leona nearly collided with a tall, older physician wearing a white coat embroidered with Dr. Sebastian Pierce. He glanced at her name badge, a flicker of recognition crossing his stern features. Nurse Dorson, correct? He said, his tone crisp but polite. You're assigned to Clara Reynolds, yes? Leona nodded, summoning her professional demeanor. Yes, doctor. Is there anything you need regarding Mrs. Reynolds? He paused. I plan to run a few additional tests on her. Make sure you have her prepared by tomorrow morning. Then, with a clipped nod, he stepped away, leaving Leona standing in the corridor. She couldn't ignore the subtle sense of intimidation in his gaze, nor the quick, dismissive tone in his voice. Over the next few hours, Leona managed her workload with a growing sense of unease. The hospital's usual hustle was overshadowed by the question of whether Dr. Pierce's brusque manner masked something darker. She watched from a distance as he interacted with staff. Some flinched when he barked orders. Others seemed eager to please him, perhaps hoping to avoid scrutiny. Finally, her shift approached its end. She tidied up her notes, completed final checks, and bid quick farewells to her patients. But thoughts of Clara lingered. Should she voice her concerns? To whom could she turn? The head nurse was always busy, and official complaints against senior doctors rarely ended well for temporary nurses. Late that evening, Leona found herself pacing in the nearly empty hallway near room 412, debating whether to confront Dr. Pierce directly. Was it wise? Fear prickled at her, but Clara's haunted expression haunted her more. Taking a steadying breath, she promised herself she'd do what was necessary to protect the patient. Little did she know that the next morning would present a chilling confrontation that left her no choice but to act, risking her position and perhaps even her future in the profession she cherished. Morning light filtered through the windows of Vora Medical Institute's 4th floor as Leona began her next shift. She barely slept the previous night, her mind cycling through worries about Clara Reynolds and speculations about Dr. Pierce. Still, she arrived punctually, determined to keep her promise of vigilance. Her first move was to stop by Clara's room. Pushing the door open softly, she saw the elderly woman attempting to sit upright, wincing as she shifted the blankets. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona greeted gently, stepping forward to help adjust the pillows. "How are you feeling today?" Clara gave a half-smile. "A bit sore, dear, but I'm managing." She seemed relieved to see Leona, though an undercurrent of anxiety dulled her usual warmth. Her knuckles gripped the sheets, and her eyes darted toward the hallway. Is the doctor coming soon?" Leona nodded, setting down the medication tray. "He mentioned running tests this morning. I wanted to check on you before he arrives." She tried to keep her tone light, not wanting to stoke Clara's fears. "Let me see if everything's in order. We'll make sure you're ready." Moving around the bed, Leona checked the 4-line vital signs and daily chart. As she worked, she coaxed Clara to share more about her condition, hoping the conversation would help the woman relax. Yet Clara's replies were terse, peppered with anxious glances at the door. Leona wished she could reassure her that all would be well, but she herself felt uncertain. Half an hour later, the sound of brisk footsteps echoed in the corridor. Dr. Pierce swept into the room, his white coat unwrinkled and his expression austere. "Time for your tests," he announced. Barely looking at Clara, his gaze flickered across Leona, as though she were invisible. "Nurse," Bring the wheelchair. We're heading to radiology. Clara, trembling slightly, tried to push back her covers. Leona hastened to help, gently guiding her to the waiting wheelchair. Dr. Pierce stood watching, impatience etched into his features. We're already behind schedule. He snapped, tapping at his watch. Let's move. Leona bit back a retort, focusing on Clara. She maneuvered the elderly woman into the corridor, Dr. Pierce striding ahead. The three of them navigated the winding halls, passing other staff who greeted Dr. Pierce with deference. At the elevator, he punched the button repeatedly as if wanting to bend it to his will. An uncomfortable silence enveloped them. Inside radiology, Leona observed Dr. Pierce explaining the scanning procedure to the technician, though his explanation was rushed. He offered minimal details to Clara, who seemed lost and apprehensive. Tucking a blanket around her patient's lap, Leona whispered a few calming words. Clara clutched the nurse's hand, her eyes pleading for comfort. The technician began setting up for the scan, carefully positioning Clara on the table. Dr. Pierce stepped aside, impatiently tapping a pen against his clipboard. Leona lingered near the door, wanting to stay close. She caught a glimpse of the doctor's face, an odd mixture of boredom and disdain. Her stomach twisted. She felt certain that if any complication arose, his concern would be minimal. Once the scanning ended, they wheeled Clara back to her room. Dr. Pierce delivered a curt, "I'll review the images," before exiting, leaving Leona to settle the patient again. As she tucked Clara in, the older woman's eyes brimmed with tears she struggled to hide. "Thank you," she whispered, voice tight with emotion. "It helps having you here." Leona pressed Clara's hand gently. "I'm here for you, Mrs. Reynolds," she said quietly. "Always." Her own pulse hammered with anger, a desire to protect this woman from a doctor who seemed determined to dismiss her worth. She couldn't ignore the waves of dread coursing through her. She wondered if Dr. Pierce's hostility extended beyond words. Was he capable of more direct harm? Later that afternoon, an urgent beep again pierced the hallway's background noise. This time, Leona raced to Clara's room, heart pounding. She swung open the door, expecting another spill or perhaps a sudden complication. Instead, she found Clara trembling, tears streaking her cheeks, while Dr. Pierce loomed beside the bed. A stifling odor hung in the air, similar to before. Clara's gown was stained again, a sickening echo of the earlier incident. The doctor shot Leona a glare, stepping away from the bed as if ensuring distance from the messy scene. "What's going on?" Leona asked, forcing calm into her voice. She moved closer, noticing Clara's anguished expression. "She's had another accident," Dr. Pierce drawled, the faintest sneer curling his lip. "It's becoming a habit, apparently." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Clean her up, nurse." Leona's blood boiled at his contempt. Yet she carefully approached Clara, who was shaking violently. "Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said softly, "I'll help you, don't worry." She began changing the bedding, gently wiping away the stains. But as she worked, Clara's whispered words nearly broke her heart. "Wasn't me. He did it again." "I'm sorry," Clara gasped, terrified to speak louder. Leona's breath caught in her throat. This was no random accident. She turned to confront Dr. Pierce, but he had already started for the door. "Handle it, nurse," he snapped, disappearing into the hallway without a backward glance. All the doubts in Leona's mind crystallized into certainty. Something vile was happening in this room. Abuse, pure and simple. She gently comforted Clara, urging her to rest. This time, Leona wouldn't stay silent. She intended to escalate the situation, no matter the risk. If Dr. Pierce was abusing his authority and harming patients, she would do everything in her power to stop him. In that moment, she made a choice that would change both their lives. She would not let fear or the hospital's hierarchy silence her. Clara's well-being, and perhaps that of many others, depended on her willingness to speak out. Determined, Leona dashed to the nearest empty corridor, her heart hammering in her chest. She pulled her phone from her pocket, ready to dial the hospital's internal hotline or perhaps an external authority. But she hesitated, overwhelmed by the ramifications of accusing a senior doctor. She recalled his dismissive stares, his arrogance, and his apparent confidence that no one would dare challenge him. Still, the memory of Clara's horrified whisper, "He did it again," echoed in her mind, fueling her resolve. If Dr. Pierce felt untouchable, that only meant his actions might worsen unchecked. Chewing her lip, she decided to do what she believed was right. Her first instinct was to approach the head nurse with her account, but the potential for internal cover-up or disbelief loomed. Instead, she dialed 911. The moment an operator answered, Leona's composure wavered, her voice trembling. "I'm calling from Vora Medical Institute. I need to report a potential case of elder abuse by a physician," she said, breath catching in her throat. The operator, calm and direct, asked for details. Leona recounted the two incidents, the disturbing remarks she'd witnessed, and the fear Clara displayed. "I can't stand by," Leona concluded, voice cracking. "She's terrified, and I suspect it's happened before." Reassured that officers would respond promptly, Leona ended the call, adrenaline surging. Was she risking her career? Almost certainly. But the alternative, allowing a vulnerable patient to suffer in silence, was far worse. Time blurred as she returned to Clara's bedside, offering gentle conversation to distract the older woman from her looming anxieties. Clara clutched Leona's hand, eyes welling with relief when Leona whispered that help was on the way. Yet beneath that relief was palpable fear. Would the system truly protect her against the doctor's power? Half an hour later, two police officers, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other petite with sharp, observant eyes, arrived at the hospital. Leona guided them through the labyrinth of hallways to Clara's room. Clara seemed visibly shaken by their uniforms, but Leona introduced them softly, explaining they were here to help, not to harm. Standing near the door, Leona recounted the incidents with as much clarity as she could, while Clara, faltering at first, gradually found her voice. She spoke of how Dr. Pierce had belittled her, the repeated humiliations, his chilling disregard for her dignity. The older woman's voice broke occasionally, yet each revelation strengthened her resolve. The officers listened intently, jotting notes and asking questions in low, empathetic tones. They confirmed that allegations of elder abuse and discrimination warranted serious investigation. "We'll need to interview Dr. Pierce," the taller officer said, "and gather statements from other staff if possible." Just then, movement in the hallway signaled Dr. Pierce's approach. Leona tensed, stepping aside as he strode into the room, brow furrowed with apparent irritation. His gaze flicked dismissively over the uniformed officers. "What's going on here?" he demanded, voice clipped. The petite officer introduced herself and her partner, stating they were investigating a report of possible mistreatment of Clara Reynolds. Dr. Pierce's expression hardened. He rolled his eyes, scoffing. "Ridiculous. This is a waste of everyone's time. That nurse is overstepping." Officer Com remained unwavering. "Sir, we have reason to believe you may have engaged in conduct that jeopardized Mrs. Reynolds' well-being. We need you to answer a few questions." He folded his arms defiantly. "I have a busy schedule. Do I look like I have time for nonsense?" Leona, standing protectively by Clara, felt her pulse quicken. The tension was palpable. She exchanged a glance with the older woman, silently encouraging her to stay strong. The quiet officer then chimed in. "Your patient has reported two incidents, as well as racially charged statements. We take such claims seriously, especially involving a vulnerable adult." Dr. Pierce's posture stiffened, indignation flaring in his eyes. Rather than denying anything, he let out a derisive laugh. "This woman is exaggerating. She's incompetent, can't manage her own bodily functions. A burden on resources. That's not a crime, it's reality." A hush fell over the room at his callous words. Even the officers appeared taken aback by his cold candor. Clara's face crumpled, tears escaping down her cheeks. Leona pressed her lips together, fury bubbling inside. The moment was both horrifying and revealing. Dr. Pierce was blatantly admitting his disregard for Clara as a person. One of the officers stepped forward, quiet authority in each syllable. Dr. Pierce, your statements suggest a violation of this patient's civil rights. We'll need you to step outside to continue this conversation. He flared with anger. You can't be serious. I'm a respected doctor here. I'll have your badges. Without flinching, the officer repeated the request, more firmly. Dr. Pierce's face reddened as he realized the situation was beyond his control. At last, with a muttered curse, he stomped into the hallway, the officers following. Once the door shut, Leona exhaled shakily, placing a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. It's going to be all right, she whispered, though her own nerves still jangled. She couldn't predict how the hospital administration or Dr. Pierce's connections would react. But with the police involved, ignoring this wasn't an option. In that charged atmosphere, Clara took a trembling breath. Thank you, she murmured, eyes flicking between the closed door and Leona's earnest face. I never thought someone would believe me, or stand up for me. Leona squeezed her hand gently. I'll always stand up for what's right, she replied, voice thick with emotion. And you deserve justice, Mrs. Reynolds. Outside, muffled voices indicated the officer's stern questioning. Leona prayed they'd gather enough evidence to hold Dr. Pierce accountable. A swirl of relief and apprehension settled in her chest. She had done what her conscience demanded, but there was no telling how far the repercussions might spread. For Clara, for herself, and for the hospital's patients who unknowingly entrusted their care to a man like Pierce. As the interrogation in the hallway continued, hospital staff gathered at a distance, trading whispers about the sudden presence of law enforcement. Some recognized Dr. Pierce's heated tone. Others, perplexed, wondered if the revered cardiologist had committed a serious offense. Tension built in the corridors as word spread. Inside room 412, Leona stayed close to Clara, offering silent support. At one point, the smaller officer returned, asked Clara a few more questions, then stepped outside again. It was an intense wait, every second stretching. Clara's hand remained clasped in Leona's, the older woman trembling despite the nurse's calm presence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the two officers escorted Dr. Pierce back into the room. His face was pale but twisted with anger. In a quiet, controlled tone, the taller officer said, Dr. Pierce, we have grounds to take you into custody for alleged elder abuse and possible civil rights violations. We'll continue the investigation downtown. Are you insane? Dr. Pierce spluttered, eyes darting between Clara, Leona, and the officers. I'm a medical professional with decades of experience. This is an outrage. Even at this juncture, he didn't deny his actions, only ranted about his status. The officer remained stoic. Sir, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney. As the officer recited the Miranda rights, Dr. Pierce's gaze shifted, landing on Leona. She returned his stare with quiet determination, steeling herself against his silent fury. He'd threatened her career once. She suspected he would do so again, but she refused to waver. Is there anyone here who sees reason? He demanded, thrashing as the officers guided him toward the door. That nurse is lying. The patient is incompetent. This is madness. Yet none of the bystanders stepped forward to defend him. Instead, a hush fell over staff who'd witnessed his brusque style for years. Some looked relieved. Others looked downright pleased that he was finally being held accountable. Murmurs rippled through them as Pierce, handcuffed, disappeared around the corner, cursing under his breath. Relief flooded Leona's lungs in a long exhale. She turned to Clara, whose wide eyes brimmed with tears of astonishment, maybe even joy. The older woman's breathing hitched, but a small, triumphant smile curved her lips. Is it over? She whispered. Leona reached for Clara's hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. It's not entirely over, she said softly. But he's out of this hospital for now. You won't have to face him here again. And if you choose to press charges, you'll have support. Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. She drew in a trembling breath. I never thought I'd see the day someone would actually stop him. I was convinced he'd win because, well, men like him usually do. The nurse felt a pang in her chest at the truth of those words. Systemic injustice often shielded people in power, but in this instance, accountability had broken through. You're not alone anymore, Leona reassured. We'll make sure he doesn't come back. A flurry of activity in the hallway signaled that the hospital administration had arrived, no doubt to manage the fallout. A stern-faced supervisor marched toward them, with a cluster of staff trailing behind. Peering inside the room, the supervisor asked for a summary of events. Leona explained calmly, aware that this might set the tone for any subsequent internal investigation. Clara mustered her courage, echoing what she'd told the police. Her voice wavered, but clarity shone through each syllable. She spoke of the repeated humiliation, the racist remarks, the indignity of being treated as lesser. The supervisor took notes, nodding gravely. Though no immediate promises were made, the environment seemed to shift. It was undeniable that Dr. Pierce had crossed a line, and that staff recognized it. When they left, Clara's shoulders slumped. Exhaustion etched across her face. Leona noticed the toll it took for the elderly woman to relive her trauma. Please rest now, Leona urged, helping Clara settle back against the pillows. I'll keep checking on you. Clara offered a grateful nod. Her eyelids fluttered with weariness, the day's events draining her energy. Within minutes, she dozed off in the quiet hush of the room. Leona sat for a moment, observing the calm rise and fall of the older woman's chest. A swirl of pride and relief coursed through her. They had faced injustice head-on and emerged with a sense of hope. When Leona finally stood, she saw her reflection in the wall-mounted monitor. She felt different, a mix of emotional fatigue and renewed purpose. Nursing had always been about compassion, but this experience tested her ethics in ways she never imagined. She'd stood up to a powerful figure, risking everything for a patient's welfare. Outside in the corridor, staff members approached with hushed questions. Some offered support, praising her courage. Others looked uneasy, as though uncertain how to react when a revered doctor was led away in handcuffs. Still, the undercurrent was clear. Many had suspected Dr. Pierce was problematic, but nobody dared challenge him, until now. Eventually, Leona stepped away from the bustle, needing a moment to breathe. She paused near a large window overlooking the hospital's courtyard. Sunlight glowed on the manicured lawns below. She recalled how, only days ago, this place felt overwhelming. A giant institution with corners she barely knew. Now, it felt like a stage where she'd enacted a moral stand. She smiled sadly, thinking of Clara's relief. Standing up to wrongdoing was never easy, but was necessary. She knew phone calls and paperwork awaited, giving statements, ensuring Clara's legal protection, perhaps dealing with hospital inquiries. Yet in her heart, she felt sure she'd done the right thing. Protecting a vulnerable patient, defending human dignity. This was why she became a nurse. In the aftermath of Dr. Pierce's arrest, the hospital buzzed with talk of investigations, potential lawsuits, and the possible removal of one of its most senior physicians. Clara Reynolds, free at last from his maltreatment, began to mend in both body and spirit. Though still shaken, she expressed overwhelming gratitude toward Leona, who continued to visit her daily. Their bond exemplified the true essence of caregiving, a relationship built on trust, compassion, and advocacy for the vulnerable. Leona found herself at the heart of a moral storm. Some colleagues hailed her as a hero for speaking out. Others worried about repercussions on the hospital's reputation. She had no illusions about the challenges ahead. Legal procedures, official reviews, and personal scrutiny would follow. Yet the nurse stood firm in her conviction that no one, regardless of rank or status, was above ethical duty. By exposing Dr. Pierce's wrongdoing, she shed light on the moral imperative that underpins healthcare, to protect and heal, not to harm. As time passed, Clara's condition improved enough for her to look forward to returning home. She planned to pursue legal action, and Leona, true to her word, offered unwavering support. Neither could predict the final outcome in court or the hospital's administrative findings. But together, they had made a decisive stand for justice. For Leona, the ordeal reaffirmed why she chose nursing. In championing a voiceless patient, she reconnected with the profession's deepest values: empathy, courage, and the resolve to do what is right, even in the face of intimidation. Though the future remained uncertain, Clara's newfound hope and the collective relief among staff signaled a brighter path ahead, one where integrity, rather than fear or prejudice, would guide the hands that heal.